Okay, everyone, I think we'll get started next and cover the carrots part of the Cars and Carrots title for this event today. I'm Dave Salmonsen with the American Farm Bureau Federation. Happy to be here, and I think the whole panel is happy to visit with you today about agriculture's interests in NAFTA. To say that we're interested in something that affects two of our three largest export partners is an understatement. Seriously interested. And I think agriculture recognized early on that this was something we had to be deeply engaged in. We had to talk with the incoming administration. We had to remind our friends on Capitol Hill how important NAFTA was to agricultural trade, and it's something we've been engaged in these last many months. I know that within the handout from Terry Stewart, he has a very good outline within here of all the things that have happened and will happen as far as process. I'll briefly highlight a few of those because they've happened so quickly, and all of us are trying to keep up with everything that's been going on. Of course, once we had Mr. Lighthizer confirmed as the USTR, very rapidly after that, they sent up the 90-day notice to the Hill that the administration's intent to engage in negotiations on NAFTA with Canada and Mexico. USTR has announced a hearing on June 27th to take testimony on that issue. Comments are due on June 12th, so everybody has to be busily working away at that. And the timing of the 90-day notice, then negotiations can formally begin after August 16th. So we waited a little bit, and now we've got a very quick time schedule ahead of us. Happy to introduce to you our panel today, which will cover a wide variety of issues affecting agriculture and how NAFTA works in their worlds. We'll start off with Ken Barbic from Western Growers. Then we'll hear from Shawna Morris, who's with the U.S. Dairy Export Council and the National Milk Producers Federation. Molly O'Connor will go next with the National Association of Wheat Growers. And we'll finish up with Nick Giordano from the National Pork Producers Council, and their bios are in the handout. So I'll invite Ken to the podium.
Good morning. Thank you again to Judge for the opportunity to be here this morning and to speak on this topic. It's obviously been highlighted as a very important issue for many sectors of the economy, but agriculture in particular plays a vital role in terms of what we're thinking about in terms of NAFTA going forward. Just by way of introduction, Western Growers is a trade association representing the fresh produce industry. Our members are headquartered in 4 primary states: California, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. And our members operate in about 30 different states in addition to those 4, as well as about 25 different countries. So a lot of our membership is international, global in terms of their reach, and issues like trade matter very much to the operations of many fresh produce growers. Just to give you a sense of the industry, California alone represents about 60% of fresh produce production in the United States. So fruits, vegetables, tree nuts, 60% of what the United States grows comes from the state of California alone. There are over 300 commodities in the sector. So when you look at something with that kind of commodity diversity, having one single view about how all these issues play out is a little bit difficult to kind of pin, here's the one view for fresh produce. Different commodities may have slightly different views, and that's going to be dictated probably to some degree on where you grow, what you're growing, the size of your operation, and those kind of factors. So let me just preview a little bit. I'm going to talk about the overall produce trade picture in the NAFTA arrangement, so with Canada and Mexico. I'm going to talk about non-NAFTA factors at play with our production and imports and exports. So we've seen differences in trade flows. Those are not all related necessarily to NAFTA. I'm also going to talk about what the expanded integration between the 3 countries has meant, and then talk briefly about what would happen if we were to see any dramatic changes to the current arrangements. So, since the agreement's been in effect since 1994, we have seen pretty significant changes in the trade flows between the countries. Exports to Mexico from the United States have increased in the fresh produce sector by about $600 million annually. Meanwhile, imports have increased about $8 billion annually. So there has been a significant increase in terms of the imports from Mexico into the United States. The commodities kind of leading the charge on that are avocados, tomatoes, berries, grapes, melons, asparagus, as well as other fruit and vegetable commodities. Meanwhile, export growth has been led in particular by apples, stone fruit, and tree nuts going into Mexico. It's worth noting that prior to NAFTA going into effect, many of the fruit and vegetable tariff rates were already relatively low coming into the United States, with the exception of asparagus and melons, which had a 25 and 35% tariff, respectively. Exports to Canada have also increased, as well as imports. The export side has increased more dramatically from the United States than with Mexico. So we've seen a $2.5 billion annual increase from before NAFTA went into effect to 2016. Those export levels have increased. That's been led primarily by table grapes, citrus, berries, the leafy green category, so all of your lettuces, those kind of things, as well as apples and tree nuts. We've also seen an increase in imports from Canada of about $1.4 billion since the agreement's gone into effect. While we've seen considerable increase, so you see that kind of picture of increased imports, while we've seen a considerable increase in the produce sector, we've also seen at the same time an increased production value in the United States. So it's not as though all of that product is just left and there's now that much less being produced in the U.S. We've actually seen almost a doubling in terms of production value. So in 1994, the production value for those commodities was about $24 billion. And in 2016, it was over $47 billion. So we've seen an increase in terms of the domestic production. Also, the total number of acres across all the fruit, vegetable, and tree nut commodities in the United States since NAFTA went into effect, the total acreage has actually increased modestly, so between 5 and 10%. There's been a lot of commodity shifting, so it's not that we're growing exactly the same commodities at the same levels, but overall in the sector we've seen an increase since NAFTA went into effect. That said, the overall picture may not be the same as what you would see in a particular commodity. So you may hear some commodities may have different views in terms of how they see NAFTA and trade playing out for them. Trade dynamics facing apples are different than those facing potatoes. Almonds and pistachios have a very different story than maybe asparagus would have. A producer's view of NAFTA is likely going to be impacted, again, by what they grow, where they grow, what their harvest window is, and the size of their operation. So all those factors are going to be at play in terms of how someone's going to view the agreement. So beyond differences even between commodities, so it's not even just you can say, here's the view of one commodity. Different regions may have different feelings about trade. So they may feel the impacts of foreign competition in different ways. So a strawberry grower in California may have different feelings than a strawberry grower in Florida about the way trade is impacting them or the competitive pressures that they may be facing. A lot of this is going to be due to seasonal or climatological differences in what their production windows may be. These distinctions can be true even for a commodity within a single state. So it's not even, just to complicate it further, it's not even enough to say, this product coming from this state or this state are going to have different views or the same view, even in the same state. So by way of example, table grapes. U.S. table grape production is located almost exclusively in California. The most productive table grape growing area in the world is located in vineyards stretching from just south of Bakersfield to just north of Fresno in the San Joaquin Valley of California. So in the summer months, that's where you're going to be getting almost all of your table grapes from if you're eating that product in the summer. Those grapes are reaching their harvest maturity between early June, and they're being harvested all the way through early November in the San Joaquin Valley. On the other side, there's significant counter-seasonal production south of the equator. So if you go to the grocery store in the wintertime, you see, product of Chile or product of Brazil. There's significant production in Chile, Brazil, increasingly Peru, and that product often is coming into the U.S. market in the kind of late fall through the late spring months. But also in the state of California, you have another production region in the Coachella area, so just outside of Palm Springs. Their harvest window is actually most of the month of May. So it's earlier than what the production window is for the grapes north in the state of the San Joaquin Valley. And their production window overlaps much more significantly with the production window coming out of Mexico. So the view that they have in terms of the competitive pressures and what they feel in terms of some of those dynamics has a kind of different flavor to it than table grape growers even from the same state, but 200 miles north of where they're located. So it's just important to kind of have those kind of things in mind as you think about some of these differences in agriculture. Again, a producer's view on whether trade, NAFTA, free trade agreements in general are a beneficial thing is going to be impacted by these different kind of factors. And over the past 25 years, there are certainly some commodities that have struggled to maintain U.S. production footprint, while others have expanded domestic production significantly. So with that in mind, what are some of the other factors at play? So this is not just a trade story. There are other factors at play, especially in the produce sector. In addition to the seasonality issue that I just kind of walked through and how different commodities harvest at different times and have different windows, other issues have influenced changes in imports and exports just in terms of the three countries that we're talking about, and even more broadly than that. Those issues include labor availability, land and resource availability, consumer demand, and domestic regulatory regimes. It's undeniable that NAFTA has had an impact on the trade dynamics for the produce sector, but there are a number of factors that have gone into impacting commodities beyond NAFTA alone. So I'm not going to turn this into a discussion about immigration reform, but in the produce sector, that's a significant issue for us. Trade and workforce are probably the two biggest issues our members face. Labor availability has been a growing concern in the United States, and it's had an impact in terms of this discussion we're having right now in terms of NAFTA. A limiting factor in expanding U.S. production has been a lack of labor in the United States. The USDA ERS report on the 20-year anniversary of NAFTA even highlighted this as a factor in terms of the agriculture sector and produce in particular. So just to kind of walk into this a little bit more, the produce sector has a visa program that we utilize for accessing labor. It's called the H-2A program. 5 years ago, we had about 85,000 positions requested with that program for foreign workers coming to the United States. In the first quarter of 2017 alone, there were 70,000 positions requested. So we're approaching almost the same number for the annual total that we had 5 years ago. So the growing labor demand in the United States. That visa program is incredibly cumbersome, very difficult for growers to use, but it's the only place they have to turn. So they've increasingly been looking to it for help. Additionally, about 50 to 70% of the current workforce in the United States is falsely documented. So you have a workforce that is not often correctly documented to begin with that is currently in the industry. Greater workforce access would have a positive impact on U.S. production. So a visa program that was easier to use, where workers could come into the country more freely, and opportunities for our existing workforce to have some kind of legal status would have a positive impact. Meanwhile, if we don't see those kind of things occur in terms of reforms on that front, if we see significant on-farm enforcement activities or the visa program becoming more difficult to use, I think we would see more production shift outside of the country. And so you would see that import-export, that number would shift to an even greater degree because of this labor availability issue. So that just is one example. Water availability is an issue. Development pressures, especially in key growing areas in California. You have some areas of the state where there used to be significant production. Orange County, named because of the agricultural production that was in that area of the state, has very little production now because of development pressures. Another factor in terms of some of these trade dynamics is consumer demand. So with increased desire by consumers for products, there has been a growing opportunity for product to come in to meet that demand. And often, kind of moving into the integration we've seen, it's been a complementary relationship. So there's certain products that can't be grown at all in the United States during the winter months. So 25 years ago, you didn't see raspberries in the grocery store in December and January. And now you have access to those all year long. Well, that's a complementary relationship because it actually increases the consumer demand for the U.S. product when it's available in the spring and summer months. So we see that imports, even in this case, can be a beneficial thing for the consumer experience and even for the U.S. producer in terms of creating opportunities. Lastly, I just want to mention that withdrawal of the United States from the agreement would be incredibly disruptive, and yet there are improvements that can be made in the relationship. So as the administration takes a fresh look at NAFTA, and Western growers and other produce organizations are working to identify various components of the trade arrangements between the countries and whether there are any changes that could be made to make U.S. growers more competitive. Are there any unfair practices, any ways that applying rules in more scientific ways or opportunities for regulatory harmonization? Are there things like that that could create an even better environment and build on even some of the successes we've seen in agreements such as these and create opportunities moving into the future? Withdrawal from the agreement would be potentially disruptive and potentially even devastating to certain aspects of the industry and the current state of trade amongst the countries. So the primary question we're focused on is whether changes to the agreement would improve the relationship and business opportunities with the three countries.
Thank you, Ken. Shawna?
Thanks, Dave, and many thanks to the Global Business Dialogue for the chance to speak here today, particularly on such an important topic. I'm really glad that dairy was included as part of this discussion on next steps on NAFTA, particularly since, frankly, we're one of the groups in the North American ag context, at least, with the biggest bone to pick here in terms of improvements that we very much think are needed, but we're also, at the same time, one of the agreement's biggest supporters. We certainly, from our perspective, have absolutely no interest in doing away with this agreement. We see it as essential to our industry. And in fact, what we want is to be able to shore up what's already been opened up and then build further towards an even greater opening and more dependable trade in dairy across the continent. NAFTA, or more specifically, I should say the U.S.-Mexico portion of that agreement, since for market access, it's a series of bilaterals between the countries involved, has been absolutely instrumental to the U.S. dairy industry's embrace of trade, and my members view that trade done right can be a tremendously positive thing both for farmers and for processors. 20 years ago, we had a visionary dairy farmer chairman of the U.S. Dairy Export Council and National Milk Producers Federation. He made the decision that our industry had to look outward, not inward, and offer the necessary leadership to be able to move the industry in that direction. And so now it's been almost 2 decades that we've been focused primarily on the benefits that trade can offer, and so looking forward, not backward, when it comes to that. The U.S.-Mexico agreement, together with the Uruguay round, is really what offered the opportunity to be able to shift our vision toward the export market. After riding out some hiccups earlier on in the tariff elimination years, Mexico by now has become a strong and dependable trading partner. It's frankly where a lot of the U.S. companies that are now exporting all around the world first got their feet wet and came to realize that trade can offer opportunities and, from the dairy side, not only concerns. Today, Mexico accounts for roughly 1/4 of U.S. dairy exports around the world, and those sales total roughly $1 billion a year. In turn, they support tens of thousands of jobs all across this country that are involved in the production and processing of the product that goes to Mexico. When it comes to Mexico, our primary focus is ensuring that the integration and partnership that's been built up over the years doesn't take any steps backwards. That's critical in the broader NAFTA discussions, which is why we believe those talks need to be focused on moving forward from the existing foundation of trade openness that's already been put in place. And it's also extremely important as Mexico negotiates with other countries. As the EU-Mexico FTA negotiations move forward, for instance, we need assurances that the market access opportunities established under NAFTA and currently available to U.S. companies in Mexico won't shrink due to potential new GI restrictions. So looking south, our goal is focusing on preserving the open and dependable trade relationship while we fold in a few key issues like improving SPS chapter commitments and protecting common food names. And it would be really fantastic if that were all the work that was needed on the northern side of the border too, but unfortunately that's not the case. Unlike the vast majority of other U.S. products that enjoy duty-free access all across the continent, most dairy products were left out of the U.S.-Canada portion of the agreement. And although Canada earlier this year seemed to be trying to distance itself from U.S. calls to update NAFTA, it's in fact the country with which the U.S. has a lot of unfinished homework, particularly in the agriculture market access area. Tariffs of 200 to 300% still hold back U.S. dairy exports to Canada. If that's not the best opportunity for modernizing this agreement, well, it's hard to think what would be a good candidate. Even more grating than being one of the only sectors that still faces exorbitant tariffs in North America, though, has really been Canada's repeated use of various policy tools to try to thwart dairy trade. Those 200 to 300% tariffs naturally build up a lot of pent-up demand for reasonably priced dairy in Canada. So when new products begin to tap into that demand, we've seen a notably consistent pattern of new policy tools evolving over time to try to tamp those opportunities back down. That's created a more risky and frankly more volatile trading relationship than we should have with one of the US's closest partners. The latest in our ongoing game of whack-a-mole on dairy policy with Canada has been a new pricing program that's intentionally designed to discourage imports from the US, which has happened by now, while at the same time undercutting global dairy markets to dispose of excess Canadian milk powder. That program is a concern not just for my members, but also for the dairy industries in Oceania, in Europe, and Mexico as well. And while we know that over the last several weeks here, as there's been a greater spotlight on this program, Canada's been working hard to try to wash its hands of it and argue that the program is simply an industry concoction. The reality is that the government in Canada is very much entrenched in administering the pricing programs and milk allocation in that country, making programs like this inherently tainted by government involvement and able to operate only with the direct approval from and involvement of the government too. What we're asking for with respect to this new program in Canada is that Canada not offload its problems onto us. The government-dictated milk quota system in Canada has permitted growth in milk production recently, rather than simply requiring producers to scale back slightly, something that Canada certainly would have the ability to do because of that quota system. Canada seems to want to have its cake and eat it too by shutting down import avenues and dumping extra product onto global markets. And frankly, that sort of problem is exactly the sort of action that NAFTA discussion should try to tackle in terms of removing impediments to U.S. exports and further fostering more open global competition. So to try to boil all those various facts and figures and policy points down to just one tweetable line, though, our NAFTA modernization goal when it comes to dairy would be maintain Mexico and crack Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Shawna. Next, we'll hear from Molly.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Molly O'Connor with the National Association of Wheat Growers, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss some of the NOG, as I'll refer to them today, some of our NAFTA priorities. So as we look at U.S. wheat, our climate right now is we have 6 different classes of wheat here in the U.S., which some days feels like 6 different crops all under the same umbrella. And those different classes all have very different purposes, from your pastas to your breads and cereals to your baked goods and flours. And all of these are grown across a wide spread of the United States. We are a federation of 20 states, but these crops are grown in the Pacific Northwest, the northern states that border the Canadian border, the eastern states, and the Great Plains. in terms of U.S. wheat prices right now, a lot of crops in the U.S. are suffering from low prices, and wheat is not an exception to that, unfortunately. So we're seeing historic lows currently. And in that lows last year, we also saw a great crop year. And unfortunately, that led to a lot of our crops being left on the ground. So trade becomes so vital for the wheat industry here in the U.S. About 50% of our wheat is exported annually. And so as we have great crop years, we really depend upon a strong trade partners to get that wheat off the ground. Our consumer demand is met. We grow about double what we need in the U.S. So for countries around the world that cannot produce as high quality wheat as we do, we're able to work with them and send them some great wheat. So when we look at that, and then we look at NAFTA. NAFTA has been a great benefit these past few years. So this last year, Mexico was actually our #1 export market. And so we feel very connected to NAFTA and very protective of it. And while we see that there are opportunities to discuss improvements, we don't want to see anything negatively impact our U.S. farmers. So when we look at NAFTA, in the past 20 years, the U.S. wheat that has been imported into Mexico has increased by 40%, which is significant. Since 2010, Mexico has lifted tariffs from non-NAFTA countries, and so on wheat, that is. And so they've been able, so that market has entered and have created about 1/4 of all wheat imported as these non-NAFTA partners. So if we're talking about NAFTA and renegotiations, we don't want to see anything that will impact our partnership, especially to Mexico, that would create opportunities for our competitors across the sea. We're a natural ally as we border Mexico, and so is Canada. So with the duty-free access that we've had these past decades, we want to continue to see that. But then some improvements that we think could be made are on things like sanitary and phytosanitary rules and regulations, just strengthening those. Also looking at the free trade and science-based standards that all three countries are very supportive of. How can we strengthen that together? And not so much because these three countries need it together, but more so that if U.S. is looking at future trade deals, it can be used as a model moving forward. Some downsides that I mentioned is competitors entering the space within Mexico. We also don't want wheat to be negatively impacted by other aspects of a trade negotiation, because as a lot of us know in ag and agriculture, a lot of the things that get hit first are agriculture products. So we're really hoping that any modernization can be a blueprint moving forward for future trade deals. We saw great SPS stuff in TPP that can be improved upon through NAFTA and other future trade deals. With Mexico, our increase of 40%, that equals to about 100 million bushels that are imported to Mexico from the U.S. So we also do have a grain grading issue with Canada, but we hope that can be fixed outside of NAFTA. We really don't want to look to NAFTA to fix it. We're hoping our neighbors north can find a legislative fix in their own process rather than going to NAFTA to find a fix for that. So as we move forward, from NOG's standpoint, our biggest priority is do no harm. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. Nick, podium is yours.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks to Judge and the Global Business Dialogue for having the National Pork Producers Council participate in this important event. And it's a great pleasure to be up here with my colleagues from agriculture, who I've gotten the opportunity to work with on various issues over the years. As David knows, I've never met a microphone I didn't like, but don't worry, I'm going to make your job easy. I've written my comments out so I can keep us on schedule here so we can get to questions and get everybody out in a timely manner. So the National Pork Producers Council is a federation of 43 state pork producer organizations representing the national and global interests of 60,000 U.S. pork producers who generate $23 billion annually in farm gate sales. The U.S. pork industry supports an estimated 550,000 domestic jobs and generates more than $39 billion a year in economic activity. The U.S. pork industry is the poster child for expanded trade. As recently as 1995, the United States imported more pork than it exported. But in the past 10 years, thanks to new market access through trade deals going back at least 20 years, 25 years before NAFTA, the U.S. pork industry, on average, has been the past 10 years the top pork exporting nation in the world. In any given year, we ship pork to more than 100 countries. But because of trade deals, and specifically FTAs, we ship more U.S. pork to the 20 nations with which we have FTAs than to the rest of the world combined. Exports contribute significantly to the bottom line of all U.S. pork producers, adding more than $50 to the value of each hog marketed last year, when about $6 billion worth of U.S. pork was exported. It's been noted on May 18th, the administration notified the Congress of its intention to enter into negotiations with Mexico and Canada to modernize the NAFTA. Today, MPPC released a paper on the NAFTA. The paper is intended to provide background and insights regarding benefits generated by the NAFTA. In addition, the paper details the costs associated with erecting new import barriers through renegotiation or withdrawal from the NAFTA. The paper is available on our website, nppc.org. The focus of the paper is economy-wide, but today I'll limit my comments for the most part to the pork sector. Mexico and Canada represent, in value terms, our second and third largest export markets for pork. In 2016, we shipped $1.4 billion in pork products to Mexico and $800 million to Canada. Together, these two markets represent 36% of our global pork exports and over 15% of our total pork production. According to Iowa State University economist Dermot Hayes, who judges had as a panelist in past GBD activities, U.S. pork exports to Mexico have created more than 9,000 U.S. jobs. Dr. Hayes, who I might add, has forgotten more about the global pork industry than most people will ever know. According to Hayes, if Mexico were to place a 20% duty on our pork and allowed the EU and Canadian pork duty-free access, which is likely to happen if there's a termination or duties put on pork, then the United States would lose all of the Mexican market. In his assessment, Professor Hayes also looked at the possibility of U.S. pork finding alternative markets and concluded that the U.S. pork industry would be left with a net loss of about 600,000 tons, or 5% of our production. This would cause a 10% reduction in live hog prices. At today's hog prices, that's about $14 per animal. Now, with 118.3 million hogs harvested in the United States last year, that means the loss of the Mexican market would translate to an aggregate industry loss of about $1.7 billion annually. A loss in exports to Mexico of that magnitude would be cataclysmic for the U.S. pork industry. Now, make no mistake, pork producers do and will support updating and improving the NAFTA. But if, and only if, duties on U.S. pork remain at zero and pork exports are not disrupted. The prospects of going back to pre-NAFTA tariffs are daunting, not just for pork producers, but for the entire U.S. economy. And we have history as our guide. After the stock market crash in October 1929, when unemployment began to rise, Congress decided it would be a good idea to impose additional tariffs on imports, quote, to save jobs. Despite the pleas of over 1,000 mainstream economists for President Hoover to veto the bill, the so-called Smoot-Hawley tariffs were introduced in 1930. Jobs were immediately lost in trade-related fields and beyond, including dock workers, transportation, distribution, et cetera, and within 3 months, unemployment nearly doubled to 14%. Over the next 2 years, unemployment soared to 27% as jobs were lost to other factors, including higher inflation and reduced disposable income, and of course, foreign retaliation against our exports. The Great Depression was then in full force and became global. The rest, as they say, is history. Now, I'm not suggesting that a NAFTA renegotiation gone awry would result in another Great Depression, but it could result in unintended consequences. Mexico will elect a new president in July 2018. The NAFTA renegotiation could have a significant impact on both the presidential election in Mexico and the long-term relationship between our two nations. The NAFTA has created jobs to the benefit of both the United States and Mexico. In 1994, our trade with Mexico was roughly in balance at about $50 billion each way. By 2016, our exports to Mexico had nearly quintupled to $231 billion, and these now support some 6 million jobs. And while imports to the United States from Mexico were $294 billion, those two supported millions of U.S. jobs, and nearly 40% of Mexican imports include U.S. content. In short, NAFTA created jobs in both the United States and Mexico. Now, I won't deny that jobs did go to Mexico as a result of plant closings, but it's misleading to say that trade under NAFTA resulted in a net loss of jobs in the United States. We should also keep in mind that as a result of NAFTA, Mexico made substantially deeper cuts in tariffs on U.S. goods than did the U.S. on Mexican goods. If NAFTA were to be terminated, Mexico would have the right to reimpose those much higher tariffs on our goods, thus making the trade deficit bigger. Mexico has free trade agreements with many other countries and is pursuing even more. Without NAFTA, those countries would immediately secure huge competitive advantages over potentially thousands of U.S. products, including pork, of course, in the Mexican market. NAFTA is an old trade agreement. It's 23 years, but it's accomplished a great deal, and it certainly can be modernized. But if I'm making one point, you've been listening. There are enormous risks associated with the notion that withdrawal from NAFTA could be an attractive alternative if efforts to negotiate a more modern agreement fail. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, and I want to thank the entire panel for giving insights into their sectors, specifically what trade in NAFTA means to them, but also for covering some of the broader issues affecting all kinds of sectors, parts of agriculture, including overall support for NAFTA and what it's done for agricultural exports, the importance of making sure that through the process of this negotiation, no new barriers are erected to agricultural trade between the three countries, and that we do need modernization, especially in some of the issues related to sanitary, phytosanitary rules, other things that are a carryover from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Of course, we saw three countries agreed here in NAFTA within the TPP on many of these rules changes. We want to see those carried over for the importance of NAFTA and the importance of helping trade in agriculture among the three countries. I'll now call on the audience for questions for the panel. Please wait for the microphone. I'll start right there with you, sir.
Ira Tynowitz again with MBLEX News Service. Walk me through at what point this becomes critical. If there was talk earlier that President Trump was going to rescind NAFTA or pull out of NAFTA, which didn't happen. If for some reason there's no agreement on NAFTA as we go forward to it, at what point do contracts start to be signed with other countries? At what point do you start to see an effect? Do you have to wait for NAFTA to formally for the U.S. to formally recede from NAFTA, or does it start to have an effect when there's a lot of uncertainty? And how long are these contracts for? How long could the U.S. be affected, even if they eventually do sign something?
I think for everybody who didn't, anybody didn't hear, the question is certainly about, is this just discussion about changes in NAFTA having any impact on agricultural trade with Mexico and Canada, specifically in the contracts or length of contracts? Turn to the panel.
Well, I'm sure some of you have seen in the press that Mexico is actively out looking at other markets. I mean, it's Argentina and Brazil and others. Mexico is in the process of modernizing its free trade agreement with the EU. That agreement currently does not cover meat and livestock products. Obviously, that will have implications for us in the U.S. meat and livestock sector if it does, and in particular, if we lose our duty-free access to the Mexican market. They're looking for grains and other products, and the discussion has forced Mexico to be much more aggressive in seeking out partner countries, and there are delegations of business people going to other countries. And really, regardless of what happens to NAFTA, there will be, make no mistake, there will be deals coming of this. Now, for the United States, for the pork industry, for our economy, we're not at a critical juncture here. I'm talking about what happens if we were to terminate, if this thing goes south. Obviously, there's a great opportunity to modernize an old agreement and make it even better. David mentioned the TPP provisions. So that's our intention, to make that happen, to modernize the agreement, to make it work better for our sectors and for the United States as a whole.
Okay, next question, Doug.
Hi, thanks. Doug Palmer with Politico. I actually have two questions. One is, last week, Robert Lighthizer asked for a report on the economic impact of eliminating remaining tariffs. And I thought that most tariffs were already eliminated under NAFTA, but there must be some. Dairy sector. So if you could speak a little bit about what tariffs and quotas are left. And then just more generally, I mean, do you, Nick, you made a very compelling case about the risks of moving, of withdrawing from NAFTA. What if these negotiations really do go bad, or whatever, and then President Trump gets frustrated and pulls out of NAFTA, says he's going to withdraw from NAFTA? How would the agricultural community react to that? What would they do at that point?
Okay, let's start with answers to that, about the question about remaining tariffs, and as Doug, as you correctly pointed out, most tariffs for ag have gone away over time within the NAFTA, but there are a few remaining. So Shawna, you may want to speak more to that.
Yeah, sure.
And then we'll turn to Nick.
So a number of our products were on that list. On the Mexican side, we're at 0 across the board, so all of our tariffs flow freely into that market. On the Canadian side is where there are residual barriers there. As I mentioned earlier, those are quite significant, 200 to 300%. The specific tariff depends on the particular product. That's on all sorts of dairy products, such as butter, fluid milk, milk powder, cheese. Tariffs on products headed into Canada. It's also the case, of course, in terms of products into the U.S. The U.S. has different tariff levels compared to what Canada has on dairy, but effectively between the U.S. and Canada, tariffs were set to the side. Certainly our expectation would be that that's a two-way discussion on dairy tariffs, not only a one-way discussion with the Canadians. To your second question, before turning it over to my colleagues, I'd just say that certainly even with our appetite to see significant improvements in this agreement, we very much agree that withdrawal from it is not an option and would be absolutely catastrophic, including for my members, particularly because of how reliant they are on the Mexican market. You would need to triple our sales to China to replace what we are selling to Mexico. That is simply not feasible to be replacing the value that Mexico generates for us.
Or Ken?
Yeah, I would say for us, in terms of the tariff side, there's not significant tariff barriers still in place that I'm aware of. The bigger issue would be market access in terms of SPS issues, regulatory harmonization issues. So, one example is potatoes. I think is a classic example. Mexico restricts the movement of potatoes past a certain point across the border. That's obviously something we want to see greater market access into the country. Residue levels, so pesticide registrations, that can be a significant barrier into these countries, particularly in Canada, where there's a number of crops that are not grown in Canada, so the regulatory regime to approve pesticide tolerances may not be as great in the country. So those can end up being much greater restrictions in terms of product moving across the border, and those are the kind of things that we really want to see addressed, whether it's within a NAFTA renegotiation or frankly outside. A lot of these issues came up under the regulatory cooperation opportunity or endeavor that was undertaken about 5 years ago. So we think that there are opportunities to see some of those things potentially addressed even in this discussion now.
In terms of NAFTA and if it was taken away, if you look a few weeks ago when the threat seemed a little more real that may be a possibility, I know NOG sent out a press release saying how detrimental that would be, and I know a variety of other agriculture trade associations also came out strongly against that possibility because of how devastating it would be among all agriculture products to eliminate the free trade we have between the three countries.
While you're right, Doug, that tariffs on most products, with the notable exceptions like dairy, have been eliminated, agree with my colleagues that, standards are really important. So we had a great SPS chapter in TPP. And the way I look at this is North America is a low-cost production platform for agriculture, really for manufacturing as well. So it's opportunity all over the world, but the greatest opportunity is in the Asia-Pacific region, is in Asia. They need our products there. And so we benefit by working together. We benefit by further harmonizing our standards. In terms of this agreement going south, I use the term would be cataclysmic for the U.S. pork industry. It would. And, we haven't crunched the numbers farm-wide, but my gut tells me it would trigger a farm crisis in this country. I mean, U.S. agriculture is dependent on trade. And my colleague in WIDA, what do you guys export, 50%, Molly? Yep. We're just at 25% now, but most of our future growth is going to be outside the United States. We lose significant export markets And we got a big problem. And we're going to have, I would say, out of control angry producers across the United States of America.
I would just add one point on the withdrawal piece. Kind of a microcosm example of this was the trucking issue that we faced several years ago, and the retaliatory tariffs and the impacts on trade flows that we saw even in the midst of that, which a number of us went through. So I think that gives you some picture of what a withdrawal would do in terms of the impact, kind of sector-wide.
Okay. Any other future questions? Any other questions? Yes, sir. Way in the back there. Keep your hand up, please, for the mic.
Brett Fortin with Inside U.S. Trade. Since Trump has taken office, we've seen the agricultural secretary is one of the last to be confirmed, one of the last to be even nominated, a near withdrawal from NAFTA, and now with his budget proposal, it cut export promotion, or proposed a cut of export promotion programs, and as well as other cuts across USDA. Is this administration hearing your message, and is it prioritizing agricultural exports? The rhetoric seems to be there in saying, yes, it's absolutely important, but are you seeing anything in practice that leads you to actually believe that?
Okay. Who wants to start with that?
He saved the best for last. We love Sonny Perdue, and he's going to do a great job for agriculture, not just on trade, but on the broad swath of issues that impact our producers. They are hearing us. You've heard Ambassador Lighthizer, Secretary Perdue, I believe Secretary Ross and others saying they're going to do no harm to agriculture. They don't intend to do a tariff renegotiation. And we want to hear that. And what we want to be focused on is improving a 23-year-old agreement. And we think we can accomplish that. And I want to remind everybody that this debate that we're having on trade today is an old debate. Some of us were at the failed launch of what we thought was going to be the Seattle round. Many of us lived through CAFTA, TPA more recently. Unfortunately, and going back to a question in the last panel, I'll tell you the problem is that the politics are trumping the policy and the economics, right? And the question about, well, and Doug, not picking on you, but producing it here, oh, are we going to produce everything here? Is that the point? That's called import substitution. And any economist that knows anything will tell you that is a failed policy, right? I mean, what are the Argentines trying to do now? And the Brazilians to extricate themselves from a failed policy that country after country is trying to extricate themselves, and we can't fall into that morass. I mean, our greatness is built on technological innovation and competition, and we benefit when we trade and engage with others. Now, I'm not saying we can't do a better job. We can, and I'm all for improving this agreement, and Ambassador Lighthizer and Sonny Perdue and Secretary Ross and the President, they all have the support of my sector. But our warning today is just, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. NAFTA works, let's improve it. Let's improve these trade deals.
I would add two things real quick to that. First, this is not the first time we've seen concerning things in presidential budgets, and as we all know, Congress actually is the one who authorizes and appropriates funds. And then second, I think, building on Nick's point, I think Secretary Perdue has proven to be an effective advocate for the industry already, specifically even on this issue of NAFTA. When we've heard the stories of kind of how all that unfolded in the lead up to that potential executive order, Secretary Perdue was one of the key advocates highlighting the importance of this agreement in terms of the agricultural sector. So I think that's a real bright spot in terms of what we see within the administration.
Yeah, I think we'll come to a close. One last question, Mr. Steve. Wait for the mic.
Thank you. I kept my question for the end because I think I'm one of the 4 people who have been part of NAFTA 1 negotiations, and actually started by President Reagan, if you really want to go back there. I don't agree with the basic point. We are in the end game. There has never been a deadline that mattered more than the end of the year deadline for this NAFTA negotiation because of the Mexican election. And there's a much greater chance now of a NAFTEX, a NAFTEX, than there was before the Brexit vote, which surprised everyone. And if you know where the candidates are lining up. So I'm not one who's going to try to change minds. What we have been telling our clients that they should focus on 6 really, I'll go quickly, 6 quick issues. 1, stop talking about how great NAFTA is. You have to talk about how whatever we negotiated has made NAFTA great. You have to give a victory for Trump because he has said so many negative things about it. So first thing is, don't talk so much now, talk about what you can get out of NAFTA. 2, most important, June 12th, written submission with June 27th, whatever the hearings are. Tell the USG what you do not want discussed. Don't always tell them what you do want to discuss, what you do not, but you have to keep a short agenda, a slim agenda. So get them off quickly. We're happy with agriculture. We're happy with this. Please don't discuss this. And then, of course, point your issues. 3, begin to reach out to the Mexican side. Get the allies in place. Sometimes they'll be your counterparts, sometimes they'll be importers and retailers and so on. Begin to discuss issues like GI, because you got to deal with the GI issue. And I don't know where Mexico stands on that, but reach out to the private sector and so on. 4, begin to play on what Trump is talking about as far as making the U.S. economy stronger and all the issues he is trying to push in that direction. Because the best way to argue in the future is to say, well, we had a weak and limpid economy, we had the 35% tax rate, now we're competitive. So begin to play positively for what you're hearing in the outside trade areas and so on, et cetera. Be very specific. You cannot solve all problems. Mr. Ross said very early on, he said, I want to have a living agreement. I don't want to have an agreement that stays in place for 25 years and then all of us already have problems. Begin to talk about it. How do you make NAFTA living? There will be new problems. There will be new issues again. So if you begin to talk a way to resolve things in the future, you can certainly move ahead and so on, et cetera. And of course, most important is what I call the Trump deal. Whenever you're involved in NAFTA, think of the kind, if you're a company, think of the kind of investment that you can make that will enable Mr. Trump to claim victory like he did when he was arguing that he stopped job flows from Mexico, when it was actually were balanced agreements with Carrier, with Ford, and so on. But begin to think of those if you're a company and have them ready to go at the right time and make sure to do it with the right publicity. So in short, what I think I'm saying is, yes, I agree with all the arguments about free trade is great, and we're gonna, we don't want to go back to what, Smoot-Hawley? I haven't heard that in a long time. We don't want to go back to Smoot-Hawley, but in point of fact, we are here in a negotiating situation. Mr. Trump made some outlandish comments during the election. We unfortunately going to have to, unfortunately we're going to have to save him, or maybe fortunately we're going to have to save him. I don't really know, fortunately, but this is really what we should be focusing on. Having said that, my very specific question is, are there issues that you believe, can your whole sector be taken off the table now, maybe with the exception of 1 or 2 problems, and tell the administration you really don't want to discuss pork or grain or agriculture, we're happy how it's going, and then focus on other issues? Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to jump in on that. Shortest answer to your last question, no. That certainly won't work for us. We've also been working with a number of others, including some of these groups here and a broad cross-section of agriculture through the Food and Agriculture Trade Dialogue coalitions, and particularly one focused on NAFTA issues. So there actually has been significant support for preserving NAFTA, of course, is the key starting point, but then also pursuing those opportunities for improving it. The message certainly hasn't been simply leave us out of it, have fun for the next year or so. So I'd say there's certainly opportunities for gains here in my sector and in other areas too. in response to your last question. In response to your earlier comments, I just wanted to make sure to reiterate the importance of one of the points that you brought out, which is collaboration with our counterparts in Mexico and in sectors where that's applicable, Canada too. There's a lot of commonality in terms of the concerns about the harm that could happen if this agreement were to go away. My CEOs, together with IDFAs, were down in Mexico meeting with our industry counterparts earlier this year, working to ensure that we're aligned and how do we work together once negotiations actually get started. So making sure that we're harnessing that common view, I agree, is really important.
Okay, I think we'll bring this to a close, and also just adding a little bit to what Shawna had to say. I know many industry sectors in agriculture have traveled to the other NAFTA partner countries to make sure that the relations remain strong within their industry and assure their buyers of their continued goodwill and ability to supply quality U.S. ag products to the NAFTA countries and around the world. I'll also conclude with a line I usually use when I start briefing our members when they come to town, and to point out just some of the headline numbers. In '93, U.S. agriculture exported a little over $8 billion a year to Mexico and Canada. Last year, U.S. agriculture exported over $38 billion to Mexico and Canada. So NAFTA has had a significant positive impact for U.S. agriculture, and we know the negotiations probably will dwell on a wide variety of issues affecting agriculture. So please join me in thanking the panel for their excellent presentations today.